Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
The slides? Perfect. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to be here talking to you tonight. Yes, I met Morgan at, I was doing the Nevada Naturalist training course, and Morgan was one of the guest speakers, and she also took us on a slow birding trip to the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve. And while I was out on this trip, I just realized, just as Morgan said now, that sort of really overlap in messaging between conservation for birds and conservation for insects as well. So I'm sure you will recognize some of the themes that I'm going to discuss tonight, especially in terms of conservation. And I think it's just great that different groups that might have an interest in a specific area can come together and really sort of share our passion for conserving this incredible ecosystem here in the Mojave Desert. So the Xerces Society, if you haven't heard of them before, it's quite a strange name, and they get their name from the Xerces blue butterfly. The Xerces blue is one of the first butterflies here in America to go extinct. They used to live in San Francisco, there on the sandy shores, and because of development, they've unfortunately gone extinct in around the 1940s. And so, in honor of the Xerces blue, the Xerces Society was formed in 1971. It is a science-based organization, a non-profit organization, and they work for the protection of the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And they do this through conservation, advocacy, research, and then, of course, through education and just spreading the word like we're doing tonight. And I'm sure this will come as no real surprise to you guys being avid birders, but we're seeing a real decline in many different kinds of species across the world. And there's sort of a real overlap between what we're seeing in the decline for birds and also for insects. And so we're going through this time that some people are calling an insect apocalypse, and right across the world, we're seeing the declining numbers of insects, and here in North America as well. And so why do we need to care about insects, and specifically about these insects that do pollination for us? It sort of goes back to this pollination 101. So we've got flowers. Flowers create these pollen grains, so these tiny little white spots that you can see here on our bee friend, and that needs to be moved from the stamen to the pistil of the flower, so from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower to ensure fertilization. And there's many different ways that plants can achieve this. Some do it through water pollination, some through wind, but many do need animals to actually support this process. So we've got our lovely pollinators that I'm going to be discussing tonight, but we have other pollinators like birds. So here we've got an example of our local Costa hummingbird that's also a great pollinator, and also other animals like bats. They're fantastic pollinators, and also some lizards and rodents out in the desert can help with pollination. And this is really a very important process because about 85% of our flowering plants require a pollinator to move pollen. So it's a really important job to ensure pollination. And why is that important? Because about 1 in 3 of every mouthful of food that we eat or drink that we consume is thanks to the work of a pollinator. So this is an incredible amount of pollination, and it's incredibly important for agriculture. So here, just in North America, there's an estimation that that's about a $30 million value in crops yearly in North America. And to illustrate this a little bit more, Whole Foods did a sort of visual experiment to show us what it would look like if we didn't have pollinators doing this fantastic job that they do to provide us with a variety of fruits and vegetables. And so what they did is they took out all the all the fruit and vegetables that require pollination from their shelves, to see what it would look like if we didn't have all these fantastic options provided to us. And so this is what the shelves would look like at Whole Foods if we didn't have pollinators. So you can just see how many of our vegetables and fruit would be absent. And then the next year, they wanted to do the same kind of visual experiment, but using dairy. And of course, for dairy, we need cows, and cows, they love alfalfa. That's their main thing that they want to eat. And alfalfa is also a plant that requires pollination. So if we didn't have that pollination process happening, this is what our shells would look like without pollinators. So they really do play a really important part in our health and for our own existence, but of course they play an important role in the ecosystems that we live as well, and they form a really important part of the food web. So they not only do they enable the fruits and seeds that make up a majority of the diets for a lot of animals, including the birds that we all love so much, but they sometimes themselves, they are the food as well. And to just illustrate that a little bit further, so 96% of terrestrial birds in North America rear their young on insects or other arthropods. So we always think of birds perhaps eating seeds and fruit, which they do as adults. But when you're rearing young, you really want to be able to provide them with protein. Protein is the sort of real thing to help little creatures grow. And if we look at this Carolina chickadee that I'm sure you guys are well acquainted with, it's quite a small little bird. And between a pair of chickadees, they can take between 350 to 570 caterpillars to their nest, to their fledglings per day. And so if we work it out, the nestlings are in the nest for about 16 to 18 days. And that means that this one pair of chickadees can take up to 10,000 caterpillars to their nest to fledge their brood. So we don't just need a little bit of insects, we need a lot of insects. And then we've got this amazing pollinator diversity as well. So we've talked a little bit about some of the animals that help with pollination, but we've got lots of different insects that help with pollination as well. So of course we know butterflies and bees, but there's also some beetles and flies and wasps that also help with this important task. But today we're going to focus on bees specifically, and also specifically on our native bees. And there's three reasons for this. So, like I said, creatures, animals, insects, many of them require protein to rear their young, and this is the same for bees. And the pollen that they collect is actually the protein that they provide to their young to grow up big and strong. So they're very specifically collecting pollen. So other insects like butterflies, they are kind of getting in contact with the pollen accidentally, while they're actually looking for to consume the nectar. But bees are actively collecting the pollen for their young. And then also bees can have quite a far range foraging around their nest, which can be really helpful to support pollination. And then also they're the only insect that shows flower constancy. So while a butterfly might go from a Palo Verde tree flowers to a cacti flower to a globe mallow, the bees will actually sort of stick to one species at a time. So they'll perhaps stay with the globe mallows first and then later move on to other flowers. And that's really helpful if we're thinking about the fertilization of that specific species of plant. And bees are also uniquely equipped to do this job. So they've evolved to have this pollen basket on their rear leg or corbicula. And you can see here on the left, this is a moistened pollen lump here on this female bee's leg. And then on the right, they're equipped with a little scopa, which is a pollen brush. So you can see on this bee on the right, she's got all these very stiff little hairs on her back leg, and that's collecting pollen. And then when she gets back to the nest, she's got this pollen brush on the back of her leg that she can use to comb the pollen out of her hair and off her thorax as well. Now, honeybees are not typical bees. And a lot of people are surprised to find out that honeybees are actually not native to North America. So honeybees were brought over from Europe in the 1700s, specifically for honey, and also for farmers were under the impression they needed them for their crops as well, to fertilize their crops. But honeys are very, very different to our native bees. So honeybees live in big colonies. They are very social, so they've got this huge social structure. And they're also one of the only bees that really create this excess in honey that we can harvest and that we can also make use of. So they are very, very different to our native bees. And while they are very important for crops here in North America, and there is some problems for them as well, they are also afflicted by diseases, pests, insecticides, nutrition, low honey prices at the moment. But honeybees are not endangered, not here in North America. So in 2022, there was an estimated 2.9 million hives here in the United States. And it's really important for people who are doing beekeeping to be really responsible around their bees, because when these bees escape and they become wild honeybees, they are really outcompeting our native bees for resources as well. So just as you guys have got some guidelines when you go out birding and to identify different kinds of bees, I'm going to give you a couple of tips to use when you're out and about and you perhaps are trying to spot our native bees. So where you might look at the beaks of birds and the color of birds and the legs of the birds, I'm going to give you some tips on how we can look for bees when we're out and about as well. So this is the difference between bees and wasps. So the first thing we notice is that our bees are very hairy. So they're very fuzzy little guys. We notice that they've got the pollen carrying structure on the back, those little pollen baskets. And in comparison, the wasps are really almost completely hairless. They don't have pollen baskets. They've got that typical sort of wasp waist. And when they fly, they've got the dangly little legs as well. So that's one way to tell them apart, some of the ways to tell them apart. And then we also have lots of native flies that try to imitate bees as well, so that other predators don't eat them. And these are some of the ways that we can tell them apart. So the first thing is by looking at the antenna. So you can see my bee friend here, I've got very long elbowed antenna, and the fly has got the really tiny little antennas. And while they've both got these really big compound eyes on the side, the fly's eyes are really pronounced. It almost looks like they're bulging out from the fly's body. And if these guys were going to stay still for a little bit and you could observe their wings, you'll see that the fly has got one pair of wings and the bees actually have two pairs of wings. So in contrast with honeybees, our native bees are mostly solitary, so they don't live in big hives. And because they don't live in big hives with big colonies, with lots of young bees to protect and lots of honey as a resource to protect, they tend to be much gentler as well. But of course, if we agitate any kind of bee and they feel like they're in danger and they need to protect themselves, they will sting us. But it's very unlikely for our native bees because they're not as territorial as the honeybees. And so this just absolutely, when I started getting into bees, I did not know. I grew up knowing about honeybees. I did not know about all these incredible native bees across the world. And so we've got about 20,000, this is estimates because we always are discovering new species of bees, and there's always, unfortunately, some bees going extinct. But there's an estimated 20,000 different species of bees across the world. And if we break that down, that means there's about 3,600 species here in America and Canada. And we can break it down even a little bit more. Nevada has about 100 different species of bees. And the Mojave Desert is actually a biodiversity hotspot for bees. So we've got about 680 different kinds of species of bees here. And that means if you create the right kind of conditions in your garden, you can attract between 20 to 30 different kinds of species of bees, native bees, to your garden. And so I want to tell you a little bit about all these different kinds of bees. I'm not going to go through all 600 of them, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit so that we can just broaden our understanding of these incredible creatures that live among us. So the first thing is that native bees really differ in size. So we've got the valley carpenter bee, the head of the valley carpenter bee. That's one of the biggest bees we've got here in North America, compared to our little Perdita minima bee. They're also sometimes called the little lost bee or the fairy bee, and they're only about 2 millimeters long. They are tiny little bees. So the sizes of bees can differ vastly, and both of these actually occur in California, but we get similar species here in the Mojave Desert as well. And while I've got this nice big photo, I want to also just show you guys that bees actually have 5 eyes. Lots of people don't know that either. So we've got the two big compound eyes on the side, and then we've got 3 little eyes here right in between the antenna of the bee. All bees have this, 5 eyes, and these are called oculi, and they help with determining light and darkness for the bee. So it helps the bee with navigation. And so one of my favorite hobbies is taking little videos of bees. So these aren't professional videos. These are all just taken on my phone, but I love to collect these little snippets of bees that I find during whether I'm walking out or hiking or birding or just busy in my garden. And this is actually of a California carpenter bee that was busy here in my garden. And you can just see that enormous size, and you can really just hear them as well when they're around. And of course, the carpenter bee gets their name from the way that they nest. So they like to make holes in wood where they actually lay their eggs and where they find shelter from the heat. And then bees come in all sorts of different colors as well. This is an example of a sweat bee. And while they don't always look like this is one of my favorite colors for them, this metallic green, but they come in a variety of colors as well. And this is another little video that I took, and this was actually on the day that Morgan took us to the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve, and I kind of had to make sure that I'm listening to her, but I was also distracted a little bit by all these amazing bees I was seeing. And this is a little sweat bee that I observed there. And then some bees don't look like bees at all. So this is very tiny. It's a very, very tiny little bee. And you can see it actually doesn't have a lot of hair, and it doesn't have that pollen basket on the rear leg. And this is because this is like a cuckoo bird. This is a cuckoo bee, and it does exactly the same thing. She lays her eggs in the nest of other bees, and so she doesn't need the hair or the basket to collect pollen because other bees are going to do her work for her. And here we've got a longhorned bee. So again, we can see it gets its name from those really long antennae. And this is also a great example of seeing that pollen basket on the rear leg and the scopa, the little pollen brush on the rear leg as well, to brush out the pollen afterwards when she gets to her nest. And this is a nocturnal bee. And again, we can see those 5 eyes really well here. And those little 3 ones, the oculi in the middle, are really enormous on this bee because this bee is mainly active during night. So she really needs these extra senses to help her navigate at night. Another bee I see quite often here is the California digger bee. Absolutely obsessed with taking photos of these guys rolling around in cactus flower pollen. Just love it. You can just see how she's getting absolutely covered. She's looking for the nectar, but she's just getting covered in the process. And that one I took at the Cactus Joe nursery. And then some bees are adapted to have really long tongues. So a lot of the bumblebees, they've got these really long tongues, and they use it to get into flowers that's got these sort of very long necks. So this bee can go right into the back of this flower to collect the nectar at the back of this flower. And as she's crawling in, she's getting covered. That's an adaptation for this flower as well. She's getting covered in pollen with going in. And when she comes out, she rubs against the stamen and she makes sure that this flower is fertilized. And here's another little video, again, that I took at the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve, where I spotted this Loren bumblebee. And then we've got some really specialist bees that are unfortunately endangered. So this is our native, this is our Mojave poppy bee, unfortunately endangered. And this bee has got a very important job. She exclusively pollinates our Las Vegas bay poppies and the dwarf bay poppies. And as you know, those are also two endangered flowers that we've got here. And this flower doesn't actually produce nectar, it just produces pollen. So the female bees are going and trying to collect the pollen for the little ones. And the male bees are actually very territorial of these flowers because they want to mate with the females. And in between the collecting of pollen and mating, they are doing a great job of pollinating these flowers. But unfortunately, all of them, that just shows that interconnectedness between the species and the ecosystem, and all of them are endangered. And then I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys too much about our very special yucca moth. So the yucca moth and the yuccas have got this really incredible symbiotic relationship again, where they really rely on each other for to be able to continue to live. This is another interesting specimen that I found in my garden, unfortunately dead. So this is a western poplar sphinx moth. It's one of the largest hawk moths in North America. And moths and butterflies, most of the adults are generalists, so they can go around and they can drink nectar from any kind of plant. But their caterpillars normally rely on a very specific host plant. So, for example, for the monarch butterflies, their host plant is milkweed. That's the only thing that the monarch caterpillar can eat. And these moths, their host plant is cottonwood and also the poplar tree. And very interesting, their caterpillars, when they pupate, they actually go underground to pupate, and then they may stay there for quite a couple of months before they emerge as adults. We're going to see a lot of our local insects and bees actually living underground. I'm going to talk a bit about how important it is for healthy pesticide-free soils for the life cycles of these insects. And then this was a really interesting project that I got involved with. So I went out, I was supporting, volunteering with a BLM, a biologist, and we went out into the desert, sort of in between Overton and the Valley of Fire National Park. And we went out looking for these Moapa midas flies, and they are a nectar-loving fly, so they also pollinate. But they are incredibly rare. We don't even have any photos of them. We just have these sketches that were made by the scientist who observed them in, I think, in 2007, he wrote his paper. And they come out, they only live in this, they lay their eggs in only this one wash. There needs to be enough rain that year. There's only 3 very specific native plants that they visit. And so we went out, we spent 2 days in the desert looking for this fly. We saw lots of robber flies. They look very similar, but their coloring is a little bit different. So we saw a lot of robber flies, other amazing pollinators and insects, lots of other animal activity, but unfortunately we couldn't find these guys. So fingers crossed, maybe next year we'll find them. And then I also want to mention our endemic pollinators, again, the same as the Mojave poppy bee. We've got our incredible blue butterflies up in Mount Charleston. And this is the Mount Charleston blue butterflies, also endangered and really suffering because of habitat loss due to fires and also the developments up there. So their host plant is the Tory milkbitch, and without the caterpillars won't survive. And so there's lots of projects going on at the moment to restore the habitat for these butterflies. And I was up there about 2 weeks ago. This is a very shaky video. So I was up there about 2 weeks ago, but I was hiking with my husky, and she didn't have any patience for me, say, stopping to take photos of butterflies or videos of butterflies. So it's very shaky. And I was really excited because I thought I spotted one of these very rare Mount Charleston butterflies. But I think, I mean, I got home and I ID'd it. I think it's actually the Echo Izio. So it's not it wasn't that one, but still special to see one of the blue butterflies up there. And so in the same way that we have all these guides when we start birding and identifying birds, we also get lots of different guides that you guys can have a look for when you start becoming interested in identifying butterflies and bees when you're out birding. And I'm actually going to provide you, I've put this in the chat, and I'll put the chat at the end of the talk again. But this is just a nice little 2-page little guide that you guys can print off for the butterflies of the spring mountains, and a nice other little identification guide for the native bees of Nevada that can really be helpful just as a starting point to start to identify these guys when you're out and about. So now that you know a little bit more about some of the incredible bees, native bees that we've got here and how different they are from the honeybees, I want to tell you a little bit more about their life cycle. So we know the honeybees live in large colonies. The colony can live for many years, and they make this excess of honey for the colony as well. And our native bees are really different. So like I said, most of our bees are solitary. And many of our bees actually lay their eggs underground. And so you can see here our little female bee starts off by collecting pollen. And then she actually she digs this little hole in the ground. And then she makes what we call bee bread, which is like a little compact lump of pollen. And then she puts a little bit of bee bread in the hole, and then she'll lay this sort of sausage-looking little egg on top of it. The egg will hatch in a couple of weeks, and out comes this larva. The larva will eat all of the pollen bread that she's provided it with, and then it will pupate, and it can actually spend a couple of months underground as in the pupa stage. And then when the spring conditions is right, emerge from the ground, and then it'll start all over. So this bee isn't really in contact with any other bees of its species, except perhaps for mating right at the end of its life cycle. And it only lives for 1 year. So it isn't a colony that lives for many years. And so this is what it might look like if we see it out in the wild. It almost looks like anthills. And 70% of our native bee species are ground nesting. And you might see a lot of them in the same spot, but they're not in a community. They're not working together. They're just opportunistic. The soil there is just really good for them for making their tunnels. So they really like this sandy soil. So you can just imagine here in the desert, we've got the perfect kind of soil for these guys. And then about 30% of our native bees are tunnel nesting. So some of them will nest in little tunnels, for example, in this tree trunk where we've got some ball beetles who made some tunnels, and the bees will then use those tunnels for their nests. And then some will use stems. So on the right-hand side, we've got these 2 illustrations. The one on the top shows like leaf cutter bees. So they make these little chambers with leaves. And then the bottom one is like a mason bees, for example. Mason bees will use resin or mud or chewed up plant materials, and they'll make these little partitionings inside a long stem. So they make these little chambers. So they'll start off with putting a little bit of bee bread again and the egg, and close the partitioning. And then in the next section, a little bit of bee bread, the egg, and then close that partitioning again. So in one long stem, you can get 20 or 30 little baby bee eggs waiting to sort of go through their process of metamorphosis. And then in the spring, when they are ready to emerge, the first bee will sort of chew its way out, and then the next, and then the next, and the next, and the next. So this is just a photo of a leafcutter bee on its way to line its nest. And these are all photos from my garden. And I think if we want to be sort of gardeners that support our bees, we need to let go of that idea of having a perfect garden where everything is just in perfect order. When I come out and I see the leaves on my trees like this, I get super excited because I know I've got lots of leaf cutter bees in my garden, and that they're most probably nesting quite close by. And you can tell that it is a bee instead of any kind of insect because it's these really sort of almost perfectly round little bits that they're cutting out to make the partitioning in their nests. And then lastly, I want to tell you just a little bit about the bumblebee life cycle. And the bumblebees are unique because they kind of have a little bit of half of the year the queen is solitary, and then the other half of the year she's actually living in a colony. And so again, this is not a colony, this is an annual colony. It's not like a honeybee that the colony can survive many years. It's just this 1 year. And so the queen hibernates, and she hibernates underground in the winter. And in the spring, she'll emerge and she will start looking for a place to nest. And bumblebees love to have little cavities that they can make their nest in. And so their perfect little spot would be old rodent burrow. That's really nice, really constructed, and it's most probably already lined with fur. It's the perfect little place. But they will also make a nest inside of trees, sort of rotting trees, any kind of place that can provide them with a bit of a cavity. And then she'll start collecting resources, and she'll start by making these wax pots. And in the wax pots, she'll put some honey, and she'll also put she'll have some pollen as well. And then she'll lay that first sort of a lot of eggs. And then when the first daughters emerge, they take over some of her work. So she stays at the nest, she doesn't go out anymore. And the daughters go out and they forage and they make new pots and they bring provisions in for the young. And then in late fall, she starts to lay some specific eggs. She lays male eggs, so we call male bees drones, and she'll lay some more queen eggs as well. And then when these bees emerge, they leave the colony, they mate, the males die after mating, and the new queen will go off. She'll hibernate again for the winter, and she'll start the whole process again for the next summer. So the whole colony only lives for a year. And this is some of the ideal sort of habitat that bumblebees are looking for. Somewhere that's going to be safe for that queen to overwinter, and somewhere that's going to have cavities that's a little bit covered and protected where they can create their colony. And right here on the right, you can see what it looks like in the wild. So we've got all the daughters here tending to the nest and making those little wax pots that they keep their provisions in. And then, of course, we know the other thing that bees need are flowers, not just for the nectar, but also for the pollen and sometimes also for nesting materials. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So what are some of the threats? And I think there will be a lot of overlap in the threats for insects and birds as well. And we don't just have this one or two things that's causing this insect apocalypse. We're talking about this concept of a death by 1,000 cuts. So there's lots of different small little things that's impacting on insects across the world. But we're going to focus on three areas today. So the one is habitat loss. You can't sort of miss driving through Las Vegas and you see all these developments everywhere. And often this might not be seen as habitat loss, but you can just imagine this used to be spaces. Now that we know our native bees are ground nesting, 70% of them, this used to be areas where bees would be able to nest and forage in meadows, and they're losing all that habitat. So habitat loss is a big problem. And even what we do in our gardens can create habitat loss. So I know we don't have a lot of these green lawns in Las Vegas anymore. But this is a monoculture, so we don't see a lot of different flowers. So there's no food for the bees or for butterflies. So we're really not attracting any insects. And if we're not attracting any insects, it's going to be hard for us to attract birds to our backyard as well. And we really need to think about, on the left, the mulch that we're using and even the rock lawns as well. If we're not sort of putting in some plants around that, we're again just sort of creating this barren, dead landscape that insects can't use. And then another big problem that we have is with pesticides. So pesticides is this umbrella term really for insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, rodenticides, and even antimicrobial products. And I'm sure you guys are aware of this because a lot of these insect pesticides also impact on birds. And pesticides really aren't very well regulated, and we need to be more mindful when we're using it. So we often want to put all that blame for pesticides on agriculture, but there's a bigger problem actually with the pesticides that we're using at our homes. They're not very well regulated. People aren't always using them in the way that they're intended. And when they're saying they're not going to harm pollinators, that's not always the truth. Pesticide is a poison. It can't really determine whether it's going to kill the cockroach that you don't like, but it will spare the bee. And this is just, this image that we've got here is just a very sad tale in Portland, Oregon, where a lot of the Xerces scientists are based. And this was during Pollinator Week 2013. So we just had Pollinator Week last week. And during 2 weeks, about 50,000 bumblebees died because the city sprayed their linden trees for aphids, and they thought they were using something that is pollinator friendly, and it killed 50,000 bumblebees in 2 weeks. And these are just some of those samples. This is samples that the scientists collected, and they were able to determine that it was specifically that pesticide that poisoned all these bees. And the only good thing that came out of this is that they did take this research back to the city, and they have decided that they won't use this pesticide ever again. And this sort of just an image to sort of make us realize that it's not always just the farms and the agriculture, it's us and our gardens that we really think about when we're using pesticides as well. And often the pesticides aren't perhaps fatal to insects, but they will impact them on other ways that impact their quality of life. So they might not develop properly, so their wings might not develop properly, so they can't fly properly. Or it might also, some of the pesticides disorientate insects, so they're not able to navigate and forage for food or find their nests again. So sometimes when pesticide companies say it doesn't kill birds, it doesn't kill insects, it still has an impact on them. And then, of course, climate change. Climate change is going to impact everything from all ecosystems, birds, insects, and we can already see the impact of that. And then lastly, something for us to keep in mind as well is the laws that are in place to keep some of our vulnerable species safe as well. So at the moment, Xerces is supporting this Nevada Assembly Bill 221. And so one of the problems we've got here is that insects are actually not classed as wildlife. And so the conservation efforts that Nevada Fish and Wildlife can do is really limited because insects doesn't fall under this terminology. And so we're trying to change that so that we can make sure that all of these species, these at-risk species like this bumblebee, can also be protected. Okay, so conservation. So what can we do to help? And I've already spoken perhaps about a lot of some of these strategies. So this will almost be just like a recap. But again, the first thing we can realize is that beekeeping does not necessarily equate bee conservation. So there might be lots of different reasons why you want to keep bees, but that doesn't mean that you're really helping conserve native bees. It's almost like there's a good analogy. It's almost like saying that we're really worried about songbirds. So I'm going to start keeping chickens to help the songbirds. If this is agricultural livestock and it's managed in a very different way. But again, some of the strategies for native bees will support honeybees as well. But we need to have people that are really knowledgeable in beekeeping so that we don't have these colonies escaping and taking resources from our native bees. So we know a little bit more now about the life cycle of bees. So we know they need secure nesting sites, and that means pesticide-free soil here in the Mojave Desert, flowers for foraging, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So some people will tell me, but you know, what difference will it make? This is such a big problem. What difference will my little garden make in the greater scheme of things? And every sort of small effort really makes a difference. And if I start gardening a little bit different at my home, and I perhaps talk to my neighbors about it, and they get inspired by what I'm doing, and they're doing things a little bit different, perhaps being more cautious about the pesticides that they are using, leaving space for ground nesting bees. If we can sort of spread the word really quickly, our neighborhood can become a place with all these little pockets of habitat that is going to be safe for bees, and we create this little landscape. And the more we are concerned about it and the more we talk about it, this landscape will grow. So we might not get the habitat back from the developments that we've lost, but we can recreate some of that habitat in our own gardens and in the parks and in the national monuments and places around us as well. So we know for the bees nesting sites, we need some bare ground, we need some snags, we need some shrubs with hollow stems. And that doesn't mean your whole garden needs to be a mess or untidy like that. This is an example of a little 10-inch sort of square area that these people have left in their garden that is a little bit untidy. You can see there's a nice little space where bees can sort of dig under that rock. So it doesn't need to be your whole garden, but you could perhaps have one area in your garden that you're dedicating to this. And then I'm sure you have seen things like these, the nest blocks or the bee hotels. And sometimes they can be useful. Sometimes bees will use them. It's not completely natural for all our native bees to sort of congregate in one small area like this, but some people have had successes with this. But if you want to do something to create spaces for those stem nesting bees, a very easy thing is just for those kinds of plants that you have in your garden that's got the sort of pithy or hollow stems on the inside. Just don't cut them, don't deadhead them, don't cut them all the way back in the fall. If you leave the stems in different lengths, you know, you want to sort of kind of think of those little chambers where we've got the 20 or 30 baby bees in, and you just leave those lengths to allow them to nest there, and then wait until late spring once you've sort of seen that they've emerged and they've left those stems, and then you can do the rest of your landscaping in that area. And in that way, you're creating a really easy and hassle-free way for these stem nesting bees to nest. And something else for us to consider as well is just sort of leaving leaves a little bit more. Leaves are not litter. They actually can help with building up soil health. And also now that we know we've got all these ground nesting bees, we've got all these bumblebee queens, we've got moths and other insects that are pupas that's under the ground. If we again can just sort of hold off with tidying up in our gardens in the spring, if we can leave that leaf litter for just a little bit until those insects have actually emerged, and then start our cleaning a little bit later in spring, we will really be helping them out. And then your choice of plants as well. So we want to think about colors. So bees can see the spectrum that we see, but they can also see in the UV spectrum. The only thing that they struggle with is actually seeing red. So for them, red, they see it as green. So if you've got lots of green things, your flowers might get lost. But we want to think of the diversity that we're planting. We want to think about the bloom periods so that we don't just have flowers in the spring, but plant different kinds of plants that will flower throughout the year. We want to plant native species that are already drought tolerant and that we know will do well in this area and that we know our native bees will appreciate. And so this is just an example of thinking of that sort of bloom from late winter to late fall. What are the different things we can plant for the bees in our garden? And just to be cautious with some of our sort of, we've called it the cultivar conundrum. So some of these modern varieties of plants, they've actually lost their ability to produce pollen and nectar. So especially these double-flowered varieties. And if you don't have a plant list at all, just sort of observe. If you're in the nursery, just observe where bees and pollinators and butterflies are going. And those will be the good plants for your garden as well. But I have also provided you with this plant list. So this is by no means an exhausted list. This is just sort of a beginner's list that you can look at from the Xerces Society. The link is in the chat, and I can post it again at the end. And it tells you a little bit about the flowers, when they will bloom, what kind of insects they will attract. And of course, once you start attracting insects to your garden, you'll also start attracting more birds to your backyard as well. And then just sort of, I've spoken a lot about the pesticides, but just really sort of thinking about if there's any other ways of controlling pests in your garden, and if there isn't, to really minimize the use of those pesticides. And Xerces have got some amazing YouTube videos that talk at length and in depth about pesticides and why they are really a problem. Another problem with the pesticides is that a lot of the big box nursery shops actually pre-treat their plants. So the real thing that we're worried about are these neonicotinoids, sometimes called neonics for short. And they are sometimes the seeds of plants are treated with them. So and they stay in the plant for months and sometimes years. So we really see this with for the monarchs, for example. People go out to these big nurseries that buy the milkweed there, and immediately we're sort of impacting on the health of the caterpillars that eat the milkweed because they're not developing properly, they're not pupating properly, their wings are misformed when they come out of the pupa. So really sort of supporting our local nurseries. And I know the Red Rock Audubon supports the Special Projects Nursery here in Las Vegas. That's an excellent nursery to support because they are supplying native plants and they are conscious of their pesticide use. And then another wonderful way that you can get involved with conservation efforts is through community science projects. And I absolutely love this. So if you're not using the iNaturalist app already, I really recommend doing that. It's a fantastic way to identify flowers, plants, birds, insects. I even identify scat with it. And it's just this whole fantastic community of people that can help you with identifying what you're seeing out in the field. And also, if you take really good photographs, it can actually be used for research purposes as well. Two other projects that I would recommend is the Bumblebee Watch and also the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. If you do see those species out and about, you can take a photo, and most of our cameras now tags with the GPS tag. And so you can upload that, and that goes towards research for scientists when you're out and about. And then just spreading the word, like I say, lots of our members, actually use a little signs like this. So the Xerces, we can buy some of these signs, but many of our members just create their own signs. And it's a way to explain people to neighbors why their gardens might be looking a little bit different. And also to start that conversation around pesticides and the nesting habitats of insects. So we've got some really creative members that have made their own signs as well, and just spreading the word. And then if you go onto the Xerces website, there are many more free resources that you can look at and download that will help you with creating pollinator-friendly habitats in your back garden, and also in talking with neighbors and other people about it. And their YouTube channel is absolutely fantastic. Lots and lots of fantastic presentations on there. Most of them by the scientists themselves conducting the science in the field. So it's just a fantastic resource to learn from. And you can connect with the Xerces Society through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and like I say, that fantastic YouTube channel. So thank you so much for your attention tonight. I'm going to leave you with one last little bee rolling in cactus flower pollen. And it's just lovely to come out and talk to you guys. Like I say, I think working together you might be more interested in birds, I might be more interested in insects, but we can learn from each other, and we can work together to conserve this is such a special place, this is such an incredible, unique landscape, and we can work together to conserve it. Thank you very much.
Jacqui, I have a question. I had never known the difference between the pollen basket and the brush. are there specific species or brands of bees that would have one or the other? Will both occur in a certain group of bees? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so just depending on the species, like I say, so that cuckoo bee, for example, it didn't have those structures because it didn't need it. That species wouldn't have it, but others, most of the bees will have the pollen basket and they will have the scopa to brush the pollen out of their hairs. And it might look a little bit different. Some might be more pronounced, others might look a little bit smaller. But that's the way that they carry the pollen back to their nest.
Okay. And thank you for the information about the leaf cutter bees. I've seen leaves in my garden that had that nice round circular, and so now I feel I've learned something this evening.
So it's the leaf cutters and they're collecting resources, and most probably they're nesting close by as well.
Well, since I use my interest in nature to avoid doing yard work, I don't rake the leaves up. I leave the roses to, so yes, I have a happy bee place.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. I learned a lot, took a lot of notes. And then we do have one question from Gary here. He's asking, do you think the pollinators and butterflies and even hummingbirds are going to decline due to the pest-killing chemicals that are allowed in our GMO seeds?
So I would have to get back to you about the GMO seeds specifically. I will ask our scientists about that and get back to you. But I know that the pesticides in general is having a real detrimental impact. And like I say, I'm not sure about the GMO seeds, but I know a lot of seeds are pre-treated with these neonicotinoids or the neonics. And it really stays in that plant and it sort of poisons the plant. So whether they're using the plant for resources or for nectar or for pollen, it is really problematic. So like I said, for the monarchs, for example, and I've unfortunately seen that myself where I purchased some from a big store, a nursery, and the hummingbird, the monarchs were just not able to make, they sort of go in that Y shape, J shape, and they couldn't properly make a pupa. And when they came out, their wings were all crumbled up, and I was like, oh, I'm the worst person ever. How did this happen? And then I learned it's because of the pesticides that's in that plant. It's a big pleasure, Alex. It's so lovely to be here talking to everyone. And Linda, I actually met you at the special projects nursery. I remember you were out there. And I think that's it's such a treasure to have here in Las Vegas, to have a small local nursery that provide such good plants. And I've got some of yours here in my garden now. Yeah, we've got, I think, so this comment about the Las Vegas bear poppy, and it's the Mojave poppy bee. And I think that's what's so unique here in the Mojave Desert, is that we have lots of specialist pollinators. So the same with the yucca moth and many others. And that's, I didn't realize that the desert has got this amazing diversity in insects and pollinators, but it's because they have specially adapted for this landscape. So it's just a pity that a lot of them are endangered as well. Yeah, no, Linda, amazing. I'll definitely come again. I'm looking forward to joining some of your classes as well. And I don't know if everyone was able to, if you just scroll up in the chat, you'll see I've posted the plant list that I talked about. There's a little article about moths as nocturnal pollinators, because I didn't talk a lot about them. I put in just the link to an article on the Xerces website about that Nevada Assembly Bill 221, and the other resource pages, the YouTube channel, and then those 2 guides that you guys can use when you're birding. You can start identifying insects as well.
Yes, and then I'll email everyone those resources too, so that you have it saved. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank
I
you very
didn't know
much.
that I didn't know that there were nocturnal bees. That
Yeah,
was something new I learned.
yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And again, so and we, I mean, that is like I talked about the smallest little group here in our neck of the woods, and then you can just imagine if we've got 20,000 different species across the world. I'm now just so interested about finding out about all the interesting bees in other places. And the other day I saw an Indonesian carpenter bee that was actually blue. And I follow an Australian page as well, and they've got lots of these bees that instead of the black and yellow bands, they've got black and blue bands. And I honestly, I didn't know we've got all these, that they come in such a variety. I see.
Linda says, yeah, she has good luck with the bee houses.
Yeah, so sometimes they will go for those bee hotels or the bee houses. So it's worth if you want to sort of try it out. And if you see they've got little bits of leaf sticking out at the end, you've got some leaf cutter bees in there. And if you see it's a little bit more like mud on the end, then you've got some most probably more mason bees in there. But if you didn't want to make use of a bee hotel, it's just quite important to try and clean them out at the end of the season so that we don't have diseases in those, because normally it would be natural materials that would decompose. So it's just important then to make sure that you keep your little bee hotel clean. Otherwise, just use the stems in your garden. Amazing. So you can watch the larva as well. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, and you clean it. Wonderful.
Does anyone have any other questions or comments before we log off for the night?
Well, just thank you again, everyone, and I hope I'll see you out there. I'm hoping to join some of your events as well, so I might see some of you out there. And if you wanted me to come and speak to other people about native bees, and I'm very happy to come and do that.
Yes, and then Alex says it's a great time of year to look for insects, and that's very true. It's hard to get outside sometimes in the heat, but luckily you don't have to go far to see a lot of really cool bugs.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, and George is asking what time of day are native bees most active?
So a lot of our native insects here in the Mojave are more active dusk and dawn. So before it gets too hot during the middle of the day. So dusk and dawn is normally times that they are most active. But it just depends if they are, if there's not a lot of resources around, they might fly out really far and come back later. So it kind of depends on the conditions where they occur, but mostly dusk and dawn.
All right, well, thank you again.
It's a big pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.